The crack of a hand against flesh echoed through the dusty main street of Jackson, Wyoming, drawing the attention of everyone within earshot on that sweltering July afternoon in 1885. Faith Lawson stumbled backward, her hand instinctively protecting the small swell of her belly as her father loomed over her, his face contorted with rage that seemed to burn hotter than the summer sun beating down on them. "You've brought nothing but shame to this family." Vernon Lawson spat, raising his hand again as Faith cowered, tears streaming down her dirt-smudged cheeks. Her honey-colored hair had come loose from its pins, falling across her face as if trying to shield her from her father's wrath. "No daughter of mine will parade around carrying a bastard." Faith had nowhere to run. The townsfolk who had gathered kept their distance, some looking away in embarrassment, others watching with morbid fascination. No one stepped forward, no one except the tall figure who had just emerged from the saloon across the street. "That's enough." The voice cut through the tension like a knife, deep and commanding. The stranger moved with purposeful strides, dust kicking up beneath his worn boots as he positioned himself between Faith and her enraged father. His broad shoulders blocked her from view, and the sun glinted off the silver star pinned to his vest. He was a cowboy, but not just any cowboy. The badge marked him as someone with authority. "This ain't your business, mister," Vernon snarled, his fists still clenched at his sides. The cowboy's hand rested casually on his holstered pistol, but his eyes never wavered from Vernon's face. "I'm making it my business." He glanced back at Faith, who was trembling like an aspen leaf in a storm, before turning back to face her father. "She's mine to protect." Faith's wide eyes met the steady gaze of the man who had just claimed her, a stranger whose name she didn't even know. "And who in tarnation might you be?" Vernon demanded, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. The cowboy stood his ground, shoulders squared. "The name's Hank Calloway, deputy marshal out of Cheyenne." He paused, his gaze unwavering. "And you've just assaulted a woman under my protection." The crowd that had gathered murmured in surprise. Faith herself could hardly believe what she was hearing. She had never seen this man before in her life, yet here he was, claiming her as his own to save her from her father's rage. "Your protection," Vernon scoffed, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. A marshal was not someone to trifle with, even a deputy. "This here's my daughter, and she's disgraced our family name." "Not anymore, she isn't," Hank replied coolly. "Far as I'm concerned, she's my responsibility now." Faith's heart pounded in her chest. She didn't understand what was happening, or why this stranger was intervening. But she knew she couldn't endure another moment under her father's roof, not after he had discovered her condition that morning. Vernon Lawson's face reddened even further, veins bulging at his temples. "You claiming to be the father of her child?" he demanded. The crowd seemed to collectively hold its breath. Faith wanted to speak, to explain that she had never met this man before, but fear kept her silent. The child she carried belonged to Thomas Bennett, a young man who had promised to marry her before riding off to seek his fortune in the gold fields 2 months ago, never to return. Hank Calloway didn't flinch. "I'm claiming that she's under my protection now. That's all you need to know." His voice was calm but carried an edge of steel that brooked no argument. Vernon took a threatening step forward, but froze when Hank's hand tightened on his pistol grip. "I suggest you go home and cool off, Mr. Lawson," Hank said. "Unless you'd like to spend the night in jail for public disturbance and assaulting a woman." For a long moment, Vernon stood there, his rage warring with his sense of self-preservation. Finally, he spat on the ground. "You want her, take her. She's dead to me anyway." He turned his glare on Faith. "Don't you ever come back to my house, girl. You hear me? You're no daughter of mine. With those parting words, Vernon Lawson stormed away, shoving through the crowd that parted like water before him. Several people cast sympathetic glances toward Faith, but no one approached. Hank turned to Faith, his expression softening as he took in her bruised cheek and tear-stained face. "Are you hurt badly, miss?" he asked quietly. Faith couldn't find her voice at first. She was acutely aware of the spectacle they'd created, of the curious eyes watching them from all directions. "Why did you do that?" she finally whispered. "You don't even know me." Hank removed his hat, revealing a shock of dark brown hair with strands of copper that caught the sunlight. "I know enough," he said. "No man should raise his hand to a woman, especially one in your condition." His eyes, a striking hazel that seemed to shift between green and brown in the bright sunlight, regarded her with genuine concern. "Do you have somewhere safe to go?" Faith's lower lip trembled as she shook her head. "No. I've been staying with my father since my mother passed last winter." "There's nowhere else." The deputy marshal glanced around, noting that the crowd was beginning to disperse now that the excitement was over. "Come with me," he said. "I'm staying at the boarding house over yonder. Mrs. Peterson runs a respectable establishment. We'll get you a room and figure things out." Faith hesitated, one hand still protectively covering her slightly swollen belly. "But you don't even know me," she repeated. "I can't impose. My name's Hank Calloway," he said again, offering her a slight smile that softened the hard angles of his face. "And you're—" "Faith," she answered softly. "Faith Lawson." "Well, Miss Lawson, I reckon we're not strangers anymore." He extended his hand to her. "And I don't make habits of leaving women in distress out on the street. Especially not." His eyes briefly dropped to her belly before meeting her gaze again. Faith knew she had limited options. She could feel the stares of the townsfolk boring into her back. By morning, everyone in Jackson would know about her shame, the preacher's daughter with child and no husband. She had already lost her father, her home, her reputation. What more did she have to lose? She placed her trembling hand in Hank's much larger one. "Thank you, Mr. Calloway." "Just Hank," he said, leading her gently away from the scene of her humiliation. "Let's get you somewhere quiet." Faith followed him down the dusty street, aware that she was walking away from everything she had ever known, placing her trust in a man who was nothing more than a name and a badge. Yet somehow, his hand holding hers felt more solid and secure than anything she had felt in months. Mrs. Peterson, a plump, gray-haired woman with kind eyes, took one look at Faith's bruised face and ushered her inside without a word about her condition. She provided a small, clean room at the back of the boarding house and brought up a basin of warm water and a cloth so Faith could wash her face. "You rest now, dear," Mrs. Peterson said, patting Faith's shoulder. "Deputy Calloway has paid for your room for the week. Whatever trouble you're in, you're safe here." After the landlady left, Faith sat on the edge of the narrow bed, staring at her reflection in the small mirror on the wall. Her cheek was already turning purple where her father had struck her, and her eyes were red from crying. She barely recognized herself, the proper preacher's daughter who had always followed the rules until she had given her heart to Thomas Bennett. A gentle knock at the door startled her. "Miss Lawson, it's Hank Calloway." Faith smoothed her skirt and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear before opening the door. The deputy stood in the hallway, hat in his hands. "I brought you some supper," he said, holding up a small package wrapped in brown paper. "Mrs. Peterson's stew, best in the territory if you ask me." "Thank you," Faith said, taking the package. The rich aroma of beef and herbs made her realize how hungry she was. "Mr. Calloway, Hank, I don't know how to thank you for what you did today, but I also don't understand. Why would you help a complete stranger?" Hank leaned against the doorframe, his expression thoughtful. "Been a lawman for 8 years now. Seen too many folks turn a blind eye when someone needs help. He shrugged. Besides, I was raised better than to stand by while a man beats his own daughter in the street. Faith lowered her gaze. My father is a preacher. He believes in strict discipline and I've dishonored him. No disrespect, miss, but a man of God should know better than to treat his child that way, no matter what she's done. Hank's voice was gentle but firm. Now, I know it's not my place to ask, but the father of your child. Faith's eyes filled with fresh tears. Thomas Bennett. He was passing through town with a cattle drive, said he loved me, said he'd come back and marry me after he made his fortune in the gold fields. She gave a bitter laugh. I was such a fool to believe him. Hank's expression darkened. You're not the first woman to be deceived by pretty words, and you won't be the last. That don't make you a fool. What am I to do now? Faith whispered, more to herself than to Hank. I have no home, no family, no prospects. Who would hire a woman in my condition? How will I support myself, support my child? Hank was quiet for a long moment. I'll be in Jackson for at least a week, maybe longer. I'm tracking a gang that's been robbing stage coaches. While I'm here, you can count on my help after that. He hesitated. We'll figure something out. Faith looked up at him, studying his face. He was handsome in a rugged way, with lines at the corners of his eyes that suggested he smiled often, though his expression now was serious. She couldn't fathom why this stranger was being so kind to her, but she was grateful beyond words. Why did you say I was yours to protect? She asked suddenly. You could have just stopped my father without claiming me. A faint flush colored Hank's tanned cheeks. It seemed the quickest way to end the situation. If I just tried to arrest him, it might have escalated. This way, he had a reason to back down that allowed him to save face. He cleared his throat. I hope I didn't cause you further embarrassment. Faith shook her head. No, I think you saved my life today. My father was so angry, I've never seen him like that before. Well, you're safe now, Hank assured her. Get some rest, Miss Lawson. Things often look clearer in the morning light. As he turned to leave, Faith called after him. Faith, please call me Faith. Hank smiled, and this time it reached his eyes, crinkling the corners just as she had imagined. Good night, Faith. After he left, Faith ate the stew, savoring each bite as if it were her last good meal. Then she lay down on the bed, one hand resting on her belly where her child grew. For the first time since discovering her condition, she felt a fragile hope blossom in her chest. Perhaps there was a way forward after all. The next morning dawned bright and clear. Faith woke to the sounds of Jackson coming to life, horses nickering, wagons rolling down the street, the distant clang of the blacksmith's hammer. For a moment, she forgot where she was and why. Then the events of the previous day came rushing back, along with the realization that her life had irrevocably changed. She dressed carefully in the same dress she had worn yesterday, one of only two she had managed to grab before her father threw her out. The blue cotton was wrinkled, but clean enough. As she pinned up her hair, she noticed that the bruise on her cheek had darkened overnight. There would be no hiding what had happened to her. A soft knock at her door announced Mrs. Peterson, who entered bearing a tray with coffee, eggs, and toast. Good morning, dear. I thought you might like some breakfast. Thank you, Faith said, surprised at the kindness. But I can come down. Nonsense. You rest today. Deputy Calloway asked me to look after you. The older woman set down the tray and studied Faith's face. He's a good man, that one. Not many would step in like he did. She paused, her expression softening. My Eliza was in a similar situation to yours once. Folks can be cruel, but there are always good people too. Faith sipped the coffee, grateful for its warmth. What happened to Eliza? She married a fine carpenter who didn't care that the baby wasn't his. They have 3 children now and live up in Montana. Mrs. Peterson smiled reassuringly. Life has a way of working out even when it seems darkest. After Mrs. Peterson left, Faith ate slowly, considering her options. She had some skills she could sew, cook, and had helped teach the younger children in Sunday school. Perhaps she could find work as a seamstress or a cook's helper. The thought of facing the town after yesterday's spectacle made her stomach clench, but she knew she couldn't hide away forever. Another knock came just as she finished eating. This time it was Hank, dressed in a fresh shirt, his badge gleaming against the dark material of his vest. "Morning," he greeted her. "I've got some business at the sheriff's office, but I wanted to check on you first." His eyes lingered on her bruised cheek, and his jaw tightened momentarily. "How are you feeling today?" "Better," Faith said, and was surprised to realize it was true. "Mrs. Peterson has been very kind. She's a good woman." Hank shifted his weight, seeming uncharacteristically uncertain. "I was thinking, there's a position open at the general store. Mrs. Tillman needs help with the books and serving customers. Her husband passed last winter and she's been running the place alone." Faith's eyes widened. "You found me work already?" Hank nodded. "If you're interested, that is." "Mrs. Tillman says you can start tomorrow. She's got a small room at the back of the store where you could stay too." Hope surged in Faith's chest. Yes, of course I'm interested, but does she know about?" She gestured vaguely toward her belly. "She does," Hank confirmed. "I told her your situation, hope you don't mind. She says it doesn't bother her none. Her sister was widowed while carrying, so she understands life can be complicated." Faith felt tears pricking her eyes again, but this time they were tears of relief. "Thank you. I don't know how I can ever repay you for your kindness." "No need for that," Hank said, his expression warm. "Just seeing you get a fair chance is payment enough." He settled his hat on his head. "I'll come by later if that's all right. Maybe we could take a short walk. Some fresh air might do you good." Faith nodded, a small smile touching her lips. "I'd like that." After Hank left, Faith sat by the window, watching the bustle of Jackson's Main Street. She could see the general store from her vantage point, a solid two-story building with a wide front porch. Mrs. Tillman, a slender woman with silver-streaked black hair, was sweeping the steps. The sight filled Faith with both apprehension and hope. Perhaps this was a new beginning. The walk with Hank that evening proved refreshing. They strolled along the edge of town, away from the curious stares of the townsfolk. The setting sun painted the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, casting a golden glow over the distant mountains. "It's beautiful here," Faith said, breathing deeply of the pine-scented air. "I've lived in Jackson all my life, but I sometimes forget to notice the beauty." Hank nodded, his gaze on the mountain range. "Wyoming has a special kind of beauty, raw and honest like the people ought to be." Faith glanced at him curiously. "Are you from Wyoming originally?" "Born in Colorado," Hank replied. "My father ran a small ranch there. When he died, my mother moved us to Cheyenne to be near her sister. I've been with the marshal's office there for the past 5 years." "Do you enjoy being a lawman?" Faith asked. Hank considered this. "Most days. I believe in justice, in protecting those who can't protect themselves. But it's a lonely life, always moving, always chasing the next outlaw." Faith nodded, understanding loneliness all too well. "Have you ever thought of settling down?" A shadow crossed Hank's face. "Once. There was a woman in Laramie, but she couldn't abide the danger that comes with the badge. Couldn't blame her, really." They walked in companionable silence for a while, until Faith gathered her courage to ask the question that had been gnawing at her. "Hank, what happens after you leave Jackson? After you've caught the men you're looking for?" He stopped walking, turning to face her. The dying sunlight caught in his hair, highlighting those copper strands. "That depends on a lot of things, Faith. But I want you to know I won't just ride off and leave you to fend for yourself. I gave my word that I'd protect you, and I mean to keep it." "But you have your duty, your job," she protested softly. "I do," he agreed. "But that doesn't mean I can't help you find a permanent solution. Maybe once you're established with Mrs. Tillman, you won't need my help anymore." Faith lowered her gaze. Maybe. But the thought of Hank riding away left an unexpected ache in her chest. In just one day, he had become her anchor in a storm-tossed sea. As they turned back toward town, Hank offered her his arm and Faith took it, drawing comfort from his solid presence beside her. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for now she wasn't facing them alone. The next morning, Faith stood outside Tillman's general store, smoothing her skirt with nervous hands. The bruise on her cheek had faded slightly, but was still visible. Taking a deep breath, she pushed open the door and stepped inside. The store was larger than it appeared from outside, with shelves stocked with everything from canned goods to fabric, tools to medicines. A counter ran along the back wall, behind which stood Mrs. Tillman, sorting through a stack of papers. She looked up at the sound of the bell above the door and smiled when she saw Faith. "You must be Faith Lawson," she said, coming around the counter to greet her. "Deputy Calloway spoke highly of you." Faith blushed slightly. "He's been very kind to me, madam." Clara Tillman waved a dismissive hand. "Call me Clara, dear. Madam makes me feel ancient." Her keen eyes took in Faith's appearance, lingering briefly on her bruised cheek and the slight swell of her belly, but her expression remained warm. "Hank tells me you're good with figures," Faith nodded. "My father," she swallowed hard. "My father is the preacher, so I had a proper education. I kept the accounts for the church for the past 2 years." "Excellent," Clara said. "My Harold was the one with the head for numbers. Since he passed, I've been making a mess of the books. Let me show you what needs doing." The morning passed in a blur of ledgers, inventory lists, and instructions. Clara was patient but thorough, explaining the running of the store in detail. By noon, Faith had reorganized the chaotic account books and was beginning to understand the rhythm of the business. "You're a quick study," Clara commented as they shared a simple lunch of bread, cheese, and apples in the back room. "Harold would approve." Faith smiled, feeling useful for the first time in months. "Thank you for giving me this chance, Clara. Not many would hire a woman in my situation." Clara's expression grew serious. "I've lived long enough to know that life rarely follows the paths we expect. My sister Ruth found herself widowed at 20, with a baby on the way and no means of support. If not for the kindness of strangers, she might not have survived." She reached across the table and patted Faith's hand. "Besides, Deputy Calloway vouched for you, and in my experience his judgment is sound." "You know him well?" Faith asked, curious about the man who had so unexpectedly changed her life. "He's passed through Jackson several times in his duties," Clara explained. "Always fair, always respectful. When my Harold was ill, Hank helped me keep some rowdy cowboys from ransacking the store. He didn't have to, wasn't even officially here on business, but that's the kind of man he is." Faith found herself smiling at this confirmation of Hank's character. "He saved me when no one else would step forward." Clara studied her thoughtfully. "The way he speaks of you, it seems he feels responsible for your welfare." "He said I was his to protect," Faith said softly, remembering the moment Hank had stepped between her and her father. "But we had never met before yesterday." "Some men recognize the right thing to do and simply do it without weighing the cost to themselves," Clara said. "Those men are rare, Faith. Treasure his friendship." Friendship. Yes, that was what Hank was offering her, friendship and protection when she needed it most. Yet Faith couldn't deny that something about his steady gaze and gentle manner stirred feelings she had thought long buried after Thomas's betrayal. The afternoon brought a steady stream of customers to the store, many of whom clearly came as much for gossip as for goods. Faith endured their curious stares and whispered comments with as much dignity as she could muster, focusing on her work rather than their judgment. By closing time, she was exhausted but satisfied with her first day's work. Clara showed her to the small room at the back of the store, a simple space with a narrow bed, a chest of drawers, and a small window that looked out onto an alley. It wasn't much, but it was clean and private. "It's not fancy," Clara apologized, "but it's yours for as long as you need it." "It's perfect," Faith assured her. "I can't thank you enough." After Clara left, Faith unpacked her meager belongings: 2 dresses, a nightgown, a hairbrush, and her mother's Bible. The latter she placed carefully on the small table beside the bed. She hadn't opened it since learning of her pregnancy, too ashamed to face the words inside, but tonight she ran her fingers over the worn leather cover, drawing comfort from its familiar presence. A knock at the back door startled her. When she opened it, Hank stood there, his tall frame silhouetted against the fading daylight. "Thought I'd check how your first day went," he said, removing his hat. "Mrs. Peterson packed up your things from the boarding house. I brought them over." He handed her a small bundle. "Thank you," Faith said, taking it from him. "And thank you for arranging this position. Clara has been wonderful." Hank looked pleased. "She's a fine woman. Her husband was a friend." Faith hesitated, then stepped back. "Would you like to come in?" "It's not much, but I don't want to impose," Hank said quickly. "It wouldn't be proper just for a moment," Faith insisted. "Please." After a brief hesitation, Hank entered the small room, seeming to fill the space with his presence. He kept his hat in his hands, turning it nervously. "I wanted to tell you," he said. "I may have a lead on the gang I've been tracking. If it pans out, I'll need to ride out tomorrow." Faith's heart sank, though she tried not to show it. "Oh, I see." "I won't be gone more than a day or 2, he added quickly. "And Sheriff Turner knows to keep an eye on the store while I'm away." He paused. "Have you had any trouble today? With the townsfolk, I mean." Faith shook her head. "Some stares, some whispers, but nothing I can't handle." "And your father?" "I haven't seen him," Faith said, relieved that this was true. "I expect he meant what he said about me being dead to him." Hank's expression darkened. "A father should protect his child, not cast her out when she needs him most." "He believes he's upholding God's law," Faith said softly, though she couldn't keep the hurt from her voice. "In his eyes, I've sinned beyond redemption." "Then, with all due respect, he's missed the point of the good book," Hank said firmly. "My mother always taught me that love and forgiveness were at the heart of true faith, not judgment and punishment." Faith looked up at him in surprise. "Your mother taught you the scriptures?" A small smile touched Hank's lips. "Every Sunday without fail." She may have been a rancher's wife, but she knew her Bible as well as any preacher. Faith found herself returning his smile, feeling a connection that went beyond their brief acquaintance. "She sounds like a remarkable woman." "She was," Hank said, a trace of sadness in his voice. "Lost her to fever 3 winters ago." "I'm sorry," Faith said, understanding the pain of such loss. "My mother passed last winter, pneumonia." They stood in silence for a moment, sharing the unspoken bond of those who had known grief. Then Hank cleared his throat. "I should let you rest. You've had a long day." As he turned to leave, Faith impulsively reached out and touched his arm. "Hank, be careful tomorrow, with the outlaws, I mean." His expression softened, and he covered her hand with his own. "I will, and I'll be back before you know it." After he left, Faith sat on the edge of the bed, her hand still warm where he had touched it. She couldn't deny the attraction she felt toward him, but she warned herself to be cautious. Her heart had led her astray once before, with devastating consequences. Besides, Hank had only intervened out of a sense of duty and compassion, not because he had any genuine interest in her beyond ensuring her safety. Still, as she prepared for bed, she found herself praying for his safe return, more fervently than she had prayed for anything in months. The next day passed slowly. Faith threw herself into her work, grateful for the distraction. Clara taught her to operate the cash register and introduced her to the regular customers, many of whom were surprisingly kind once they got past their initial curiosity about her. By late afternoon, Faith was beginning to feel more at ease in her new role. She was carefully measuring out flour for Mrs. Jenkins, the baker's wife, when the door burst open and a young boy rushed in, his eyes wide with excitement. "There's been a shootout," he announced to the store at large. Deputy Calloway and the sheriff caught them stagecoach robbers trying to hold up the bank. Faith's heart lurched. "Is anyone hurt?" she asked, forgetting all about the flour. The boy shrugged. "Don't know, miss. Pa sent me to fetch Dr. Morris, so I reckon someone must be." Faith exchanged a worried glance with Clara, who nodded toward the door. "Go on. I'll finish up here." Faith didn't need to be told twice. She hurried out onto the street, where a crowd had gathered outside the bank at the far end of town. Pushing her way through, she strained to see what was happening. Sheriff Turner was leading two men in handcuffs toward the jailhouse, both looking worse for wear. One had blood streaming from a gash on his forehead, the other was limping badly, but there was no sign of Hank. "Excuse me," Faith said, catching the arm of a man at the edge of the crowd. "Where is Deputy Calloway?" The man pointed toward the doctor's office. "Took a bullet to the shoulder, they say. Doc's looking at him now." Fear clutched at Faith's heart as she hurried toward the doctor's office, a small building just off the main street. She hesitated at the door, suddenly uncertain of her right to be there. What was she to Hank, after all? A responsibility, a charity case he had taken on out of kindness. But before she could decide whether to enter, the door opened and Dr. Morris stepped out, wiping his hands on a cloth. "Doctor," Faith said, stepping forward. "Is Deputy Calloway, is he all right?" Dr. Morris, a thin man with spectacles perched on his nose, looked at her in surprise. "Miss Lawson." "Yes, he'll be fine. Bullet went clean through the shoulder. Painful but not life-threatening if infection doesn't set in." Relief flooded through Faith. "May I see him?" The doctor hesitated. "He's resting now. It's all right, Doc," Hank's voice called from inside. "Let her in, doctor." Morris shrugged and stepped aside, allowing Faith to enter the small examination room. Hank was sitting on the edge of a table, his shirt off, a white bandage wrapped around his left shoulder. His face was pale, but he managed a smile when he saw her. "Faith, didn't expect to see you here." Faith's eyes were drawn to the bandage, already showing a spot of red where blood was seeping through. "I heard what happened. They said you were shot," Hank grimaced. "Caught me by surprise. Didn't expect them to have a third man on the roof." He flexed his right hand. "At least it wasn't my gun arm." "You're fortunate," Dr. Morris interjected. "An inch to the right and that bullet would have hit something vital." Faith shuddered at the thought. "Will he be able to travel back to Cheyenne?" "Not for at least a week," the doctor said firmly. "That wound needs time to heal, and the jolting of a horse or a stagecoach could reopen it." Hank looked frustrated at this news, but nodded in acceptance. "The prisoners can wait in the jail until I'm fit to transport them." After the doctor left to check on his other patient, one of the outlaws who had taken a bullet in the leg, Faith moved closer to Hank. "You promised you'd be careful," she said, unable to keep a note of accusation from her voice. Hank's expression softened. "I was. But careful doesn't always mean safe in my line of work." He studied her face. "Were you worried about me?" Faith felt a blush rising to her cheeks. "Of course, after everything you've done for me." "Faith," Hank said quietly, "you don't owe me anything. I helped you because it was the right thing to do, not to put you in my debt." "I know that," Faith said, "but I still care what happens to you." Something shifted in Hank's eyes, a warmth that hadn't been there before. "That means a lot to me." The moment stretched between them, full of unspoken feelings until Dr. Morris returned, breaking the spell. "You should rest now, Deputy," he said. "Miss Lawson, perhaps you could come back tomorrow." Faith nodded, reluctantly stepping back. "Of course. I'll check on you tomorrow, Hank." As she walked back to the general store, Faith's mind was in turmoil. The fear she had felt upon hearing Hank was injured was far more intense than it should have been for someone she had known for only 2 days. Yet she couldn't deny that her feelings for him were growing stronger with each encounter. But there were complications. Her pregnancy, for one, a constant reminder of her relationship with Thomas, and Hank's duty as a marshal, which would eventually take him back to Cheyenne, leaving her behind in Jackson. It would be foolish to allow her heart to become attached to a man who was only passing through her life. Yet that night, as she lay in her narrow bed listening to the sounds of the town settling into darkness, Faith found herself thinking of Hank's smile, the warmth in his eyes when he looked at her, the solid strength of his presence. And despite all her practical arguments against it, she couldn't help the flutter of hope in her chest. Over the next week, Faith fell into a routine. Mornings and afternoons were spent working at the store, learning the business from Clara, who proved to be both a patient teacher and a compassionate friend. In the evenings, after closing, Faith would visit Hank, first at the doctor's office and later at the boarding house where he had returned, once Dr. Morris deemed him well enough to leave. These evening visits became the highlight of Faith's days. They would talk for hours, sharing stories of their childhoods, their hopes, their disappointments. Hank told her about growing up on a small ranch in Colorado, about the accident that had taken his father's life when Hank was just 12, about his decision to become a lawman after witnessing the corruption and injustice that often plagued frontier towns. Faith, in turn, shared her experiences as a preacher's daughter, the constant scrutiny, the pressure to be perfect, the stifling expectations that had partly driven her into Thomas's arms in search of freedom and passion. "I'm not excusing what I did," she said one evening as they sat on the porch of the boarding house, watching the sunset. "I knew it was wrong to be with a man outside of marriage. But Thomas was so different from the serious, pious men my father approved of. He made me laugh. Made me feel alive," she sighed. "And I truly believed he loved me." Hank's expression was thoughtful. "We all make mistakes, Faith. The measure of a person isn't in never falling but in how they rise afterward." Faith placed a hand on her growing belly, now more noticeable at nearly 4 months along. "This child is innocent in all of this. Whatever mistakes I've made, I want to give him or her a good life." "You will," Hank said with conviction. "You're stronger than you know." As the days passed, Faith became increasingly aware of a shift in their relationship. Hank's gaze would linger on her face when he thought she wasn't looking. His hand would brush against hers, seemingly by accident when they walked together. And she found herself making excuses to see him, to be near him, drawn to his quiet strength and unwavering kindness. But neither of them spoke of these growing feelings, both aware of the barriers between them, his duty calling him back to Cheyenne, her pregnancy, and the scandal that surrounded her in Jackson. On the 7th day after the shooting, Dr. Morris declared Hank fit to travel. "The wound is healing nicely," he said after examining Hank's shoulder. "You'll need to be careful for another few weeks, but you can transport those prisoners back to Cheyenne whenever you're ready." The news, though expected, hit Faith like a physical blow. She had known this day would come, yet somehow she had allowed herself to hope that Hank might stay longer. That evening, when Hank came to the store after closing, his expression was grave. "I've arranged to take the prisoners back to Cheyenne tomorrow," he said without preamble. "The stage leaves at noon." Faith nodded, trying to hide the pain his words caused her. "I see. Then I suppose this is goodbye." Hank stepped closer, his eyes searching her face. "Faith, I've been thinking. I don't want to leave you here." Hope flared in her chest, but she quickly tamped it down. "What do you mean, come with me to Cheyenne?" Hank said, the words tumbling out as if he'd been holding them back. "It's a bigger town, more opportunities. You could start fresh where people don't know your past." Faith stared at him in shock. "Go with you, but what would I do in Cheyenne?" "Where would I live?" "I have a small house there," Hank said. "Nothing fancy, but it's comfortable. You could stay there until you find your feet." He hesitated, then added, "or longer if you wanted." Faith's heart was racing. "Hank, are you asking me to live with you? As what?" Hank ran a hand through his hair, looking uncharacteristically nervous. "I'm not explaining this well. Faith, these past days with you, I've come to care for you, more than I should, perhaps, given our short acquaintance. But I know what I feel." He took her hand in his. "I'm asking you to marry me." Faith gasped, certain she had misheard. "Marry you, but I'm pregnant with another man's child." "I know that," Hank said gently. "And I'm prepared to raise that child as my own if you'll have me." Tears filled Faith's eyes. "Why would you do that?" "Take on someone else's responsibility." Hank's gaze was steady. "Because I'm falling in love with you, Faith Lawson. Because I want to build a life with you if you'll give me the chance." Faith felt as if the ground had shifted beneath her feet. "Hank, I don't know what to say. This is so sudden." "I know it is," he acknowledged, "and I don't expect an answer right now. But the offer stands. Think about it overnight. If you decide to come with me, meet me at the stage office tomorrow at noon. If not, I'll understand." He leaned in and, with infinite gentleness, brushed his lips against her forehead. "Whatever you decide, know that meeting you has changed my life, Faith Lawson." Then he was gone, leaving Faith standing in the doorway, her mind whirling with confusion and hope and fear. Sleep eluded her that night as she wrestled with Hank's unexpected proposal. Could she trust this feeling between them, this connection that had formed so quickly yet felt so genuine? Or was she simply grasping at security, afraid to face life as an unwed mother alone? And what of Hank? Was he offering marriage out of pity, out of a sense of duty to protect her? Or did he truly care for her as he claimed? As dawn broke, Faith still had no answers. She rose and dressed mechanically, her movements slow with fatigue. When she entered the store, Clara took one look at her pale face and red-rimmed eyes and led her to a chair. "What's happened?" she asked, pouring Faith a cup of strong tea. The whole story spilled out: Hank's proposal, his invitation to Cheyenne, her confusion about what to do. Clara listened without interrupting, her wise eyes watching Faith's face. "And do you love him?" she asked when Faith finally fell silent. Faith's breath caught in her throat. I think I could, so easily, but it's been so little time, and after Thomas." "Thomas was a boy making pretty promises he never intended to keep," Clara said firmly. "Hank Calloway is a man of his word. If he says he loves you, he means it." She reached across the table and took Faith's hand. "The question is, what do you want? Not what's practical, not what's safe, what does your heart tell you?" Faith closed her eyes, trying to imagine a life in Cheyenne with Hank. A home, a family, a fresh start. Then she imagined staying in Jackson, raising her child alone, always marked by scandal despite Clara's kindness and support. "I'm afraid," she admitted. "Afraid of making another mistake, afraid of trusting too quickly." "Fear is natural," Clara said, "but don't let it make your decision for you. Love is always a risk, Faith. The question is whether Hank Calloway is worth that risk." The morning passed in a blur as Faith went about her duties, her mind elsewhere. As noon approached, Clara shooed her toward the door. "Go," she urged. "Whatever you decide, you need to tell him face to face." Faith hurried through the streets of Jackson toward the stage office, her heart pounding. A small crowd had gathered to watch the departure of the notorious outlaws. Sheriff Turner stood guard while two shackled men were loaded into the stagecoach under Hank's watchful eye. Hank looked up as Faith approached, hope and uncertainty mingling in his expression. He was dressed for travel, his badge gleaming in the sunlight, a small bag at his feet. Faith stopped a few feet away, suddenly uncertain. What if she was making a terrible mistake? What if this was all happening too fast? "Faith," Hank said softly, stepping away from the stage to meet her. "You came to say goodbye," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Disappointment flashed across his face, but he nodded in acceptance. "I understand. It was too much to ask too soon." "No," Faith said quickly. "It's not that, it's just, I can't leave Clara in the lurch. She's been so kind to me, given me a job, a home. I can't just abandon her without notice." Hope returned to Hank's eyes. "What are you saying, Faith?" She took a deep breath. "I'm saying I need time. Time to settle things here properly, time to be sure of what I feel." She met his gaze steadily. "I care for you, Hank, more than I thought possible after such a short time, but marriage is a serious step, especially in our circumstances." Hank took her hands in his. "How much time do you need?" "A month," Faith said. "Give me a month to be certain, to make arrangements here if I decide to come to Cheyenne." "A month," Hank repeated, a slow smile spreading across his face. "I can wait a month." He squeezed her hands. "I'll send for you in exactly 1 month. And Faith, I meant what I said. I'm falling in love with you." Faith felt tears threaten again, but these were tears of joy, not confusion. "Be safe, Hank Calloway. I'll be thinking of you every day." The stagecoach driver called for passengers to board. Hank hesitated, then leaned in and, with the gentlest of touches, kissed Faith's lips. It was a brief kiss, mindful of the public setting, but it sent a current of warmth through Faith's entire body. 1 month, Hank said again, then reluctantly released her hands and climbed aboard the stage. Faith stood in the dusty street, watching until the stagecoach disappeared from sight. Only then did she turn back toward the general store, her mind already made up despite her request for time. She knew in her heart that when the month was up, she would be on her way to Cheyenne, to Hank, to a new life. The days that followed passed both slowly and quickly. Faith threw herself into her work at the store, eager to learn everything she could to help Clara find a suitable replacement. She had confessed her decision to the older woman the very evening after Hank's departure. "I knew you'd go to him," Clara had said with a sad smile. "I've seen the way you light up when he's near, and while I'll miss you terribly, I want you to be happy." "But your store, you need help," Faith had protested. "And I'll find it," Clara assured her. "Jackson may be small, but there are plenty of capable women who could use the work. Don't worry about me." With Clara's blessing, Faith began preparing for her new life. She carefully saved her wages, adding them to the small amount Hank had pressed into her hand before leaving for the journey he'd insisted. She sewed new clothes for herself, altering the patterns to accommodate her growing belly, now quite noticeable at nearly 5 months. She also began receiving letters from Hank Ernest, heartfelt missives that arrived weekly on the stagecoach from Cheyenne. He wrote of his daily life, of the house he was preparing for her arrival, of his growing certainty that their future lay together. "The bedroom that faces east will make a fine nursery," he wrote in one letter. "I've already purchased a cradle from Jensen, the carpenter here. He's the best in the territory, and I want only the best for our child. Our child." The words brought tears to Faith's eyes each time she read them. That Hank could so readily accept another man's child as his own spoke volumes about his character, his capacity for love. Faith replied to each letter, pouring out her thoughts, her hopes, her growing feelings for him. With each passing day, her certainty grew. She was making the right choice. There was only one shadow on her happiness: her father. Though she had not seen Vernon Lawson since that terrible day in the street, she knew she could not leave Jackson without at least attempting to make peace. 2 weeks before her planned departure, Faith gathered her courage and walked to the small white church at the edge of town. Sunday service had just ended, and parishioners were filing out, many nodding politely to Faith despite the scandal attached to her name. Time and her quiet dignity had softened some of the initial judgment. Faith waited until the churchyard was empty before approaching the parsonage, a modest house beside the church. Her heart pounded as she knocked on the door. When it opened, her father stood there, his tall frame seeming somehow diminished since she had last seen him. His eyes widened in shock, then narrowed in remembered anger. "What are you doing here?" he demanded. "I told you never to come back." Faith squared her shoulders. "I'm leaving Jackson, Father. I came to say goodbye." Vernon's gaze dropped to her swollen belly and his lip curled in disgust. "Good riddance. You've brought nothing but shame to this family." The words hurt, but Faith had expected them. "I'm marrying a good man," she said steadily. "Deputy Marshal Hank Calloway. He's asked me to be his wife, and I've accepted." Surprise flickered across Vernon's face. "The lawman. He's willing to take you, knowing your condition." "He loves me," Faith said simply. "And he'll love this child as his own, I had hoped. I had hoped you might find it in your heart to forgive me before I go." Vernon's expression hardened again. "Forgiveness must be earned through repentance. I see no repentance in you, only defiance." Faith sighed, a deep sadness filling her. "Then I'm sorry for that. Whatever you think of me, Father, I want you to know that I've always respected your faith, even if I couldn't live up to your expectations. And I'll always remember the good you taught me, along with the harsh lessons." For a moment, something like regret crossed Vernon's face, but it was quickly replaced by cold resolve. "Goodbye, Faith. May God have mercy on your soul." And with that, he closed the door. Faith stood there for a moment, tears streaming down her face. She had hoped for more, but at least she had tried. She could leave Jackson knowing she had done everything possible to mend that broken relationship. As she turned to go, a hand touched her arm. Mrs. Robinson, the church pianist and one of her father's most devoted parishioners, stood beside her. "Don't judge him too harshly, child," the older woman said softly. "Your father is a man of rigid principles. It's both his strength and his weakness." She pressed something into Faith's hand, a small, worn locket. "Your mother would want you to have this. She asked me to give it to you on your wedding day, should anything happen to her." Faith gasped, recognizing the silver locket her mother had always worn. "How did you get this?" "Your father gave me a box of your mother's things for the church charity after she passed," Mrs. Robinson explained. "I recognized this and kept it aside, knowing Sarah would want you to have it." She patted Faith's cheek. "Be happy, child, and know that not everyone in Jackson judges you as harshly as your father does." With that unexpected gift of kindness, Faith's last tie to Jackson was severed. The locket, containing tiny portraits of her mother and father in happier days, became her talisman as she prepared for her journey. The day of her departure dawned clear and bright. Clara insisted on accompanying her to the stage office, carrying one of Faith's 2 small bags. "I've put some food in there for the journey," she said as they walked, "and a letter for my cousin in Cheyenne. She runs a dress shop and could use a good seamstress if you ever want work outside the home." Faith hugged the older woman, grateful beyond words for her kindness. "I'll write to you every week," she promised. And perhaps when the baby is born, you could visit us. Try to keep me away, Clara said with a smile, though her eyes were damp. I expect to be named honorary grandmother, you know. The stagecoach was already waiting when they arrived. Faith handed her bags to the driver, then turned for one final embrace with Clara. Thank you for everything, she whispered. I don't know what would have become of me without you. You would have managed, Clara said firmly. You're stronger than you know, Faith Lawson. Now go and be happy. You deserve it. With one last squeeze of Clara's hand, Faith climbed aboard the stagecoach, her heart both heavy with the pain of parting and light with anticipation of what lay ahead. The journey to Cheyenne took 2 days, with an overnight stop at a way station. Faith spent the time alternating between nervous excitement and moments of doubt. Was she truly ready for marriage, for motherhood, for a life so different from what she had imagined for herself? But each time doubt crept in, she would think of Hank, his steady gaze, his gentle hands, the way he had stepped between her and harm without hesitation. And her resolve would strengthen once more. Cheyenne came into view on the afternoon of the second day, a bustling city far larger than Jackson, with proper streets, substantial buildings, and a sense of permanence that the smaller town lacked. Faith pressed her face to the window of the stagecoach, taking it all in with wide eyes. And then they were pulling into the stage depot, and Faith's heart was racing because there, waiting on the platform, stood Hank. He was dressed in his best clothes, his badge polished to a shine, his hat in his hands. When he spotted her at the window, a smile broke across his face like sunrise. The stagecoach had barely stopped before Faith was descending, moving as quickly as her condition allowed. Hank met her halfway, his arms encircling her, lifting her off her feet in a gentle embrace. "You came," he breathed against her hair. "You really came." Faith laughed through happy tears. "Did you doubt I would?" Hank set her down carefully, his eyes drinking in the sight of her. "Not really, but I've hardly slept this past week for worrying." Faith touched his cheek, noting the shadows beneath his eyes that confirmed his words. "Well, I'm here now. No more worrying." Hank claimed her bags from the driver, then offered her his arm. "I have a carriage waiting. I thought you might be tired after the journey." As they rode through the streets of Cheyenne, Hank pointed out landmarks: the courthouse where he often testified, the marshal's office where he worked, the shops and restaurants he frequented. Faith tried to take it all in, but found her attention constantly drawn back to the man beside her, to the warmth of his thigh pressed against hers on the carriage seat, to the deep timbre of his voice as he spoke. They turned onto a quiet residential street lined with modest but well-maintained houses. Hank drew the carriage to a stop before a 2-story home with a wide front porch and lace curtains visible in the windows. "This is it," he said, a note of uncertainty in his voice. "It's not grand, but it's perfect," Faith interrupted, genuinely enchanted by the homey appearance of the place. Hank helped her down from the carriage, then surprised her by sweeping her into his arms. "Tradition says I should carry you over the threshold after the wedding," he said with a grin, "but I couldn't wait." Faith laughed as he carried her up the steps and through the front door, setting her down gently in the entryway. The interior was simply but comfortably furnished, with solid wooden pieces that spoke of quality without ostentation. "Let me show you around," Hank said, taking her hand. The house tour revealed a spacious kitchen, a cozy parlor, and upstairs, 3 bedrooms: the master bedroom with a large 4-poster bed, a smaller room that Hank had already begun to outfit as a nursery, and a third that served as a combination of office and guest room. Faith's eyes filled with tears when she saw the nursery with its freshly painted walls, the carefully crafted cradle, and a rocking chair by the window. "You've done all this for a child that isn't even yours," she whispered. Hank turned her to face him, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "Faith, I meant what I said in my letters. This child is ours, yours and mine. I'll love him or her just as much as if I'd helped create them." His hand moved to rest lightly on her belly. "I already do." Faith's tears spilled over then, but they were tears of joy. She reached up and touched Hank's face, tracing the strong lines of his jaw. "I love you, Hank Calloway. I think I've loved you since that first day when you stepped between me and my father and said I was yours to protect." Hank's eyes darkened with emotion. "I love you too, Faith. More than I can say." He lowered his head slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished, but Faith rose on tiptoe to meet him, her lips finding his in a kiss that held all the promise of their future together. That evening they sat on the front porch swing, watching as twilight settled over Cheyenne. Faith's head rested on Hank's shoulder, his arm around her, her hand clasped in his. "I've arranged for Reverend Thomas to marry us tomorrow," Hank said. "Unless you'd prefer to wait longer. Have a proper wedding with guests and such." Faith shook her head. "Tomorrow is perfect. I don't need a big wedding, just you and me and God's blessing." Hank kissed the top of her head. "I've invited a few friends, my partner from the marshal's office, the couple next door who have been kind to me. But it will be simple, I promise." "And after?" Faith asked, a hint of nervousness in her voice. Hank understood her question. "After, you'll be my wife and I'll be your husband. We'll live here, raise our family together." His voice softened. "I've taken a month's leave from the marshal's office. Time for us to settle in, to get to know each other better before the baby comes." Faith sighed contentedly, nestling closer to him. "It sounds perfect." And it was. The wedding the next day was indeed simple but deeply meaningful. Faith wore a dress of pale blue silk that Clara's cousin had helped her find, altered to accommodate her growing belly. Hank wore his best suit, his badge gleaming on his chest. They exchanged vows in the small church near their home, witnessed by a handful of Hank's friends who welcomed Faith with genuine warmth. The weeks that followed were a time of discovery as they learned to live together as husband and wife. Hank proved to be patient, gentle, and considerate, never pushing Faith beyond what she was comfortable with, always mindful of her condition and her feelings. And Faith found herself falling more deeply in love with him each day, as she witnessed his excitement about the baby, his attention to her comfort, his unwavering support through the discomforts of her advancing pregnancy. By the time Hank's leave ended and he returned to his duties, they had established a comfortable routine. Faith kept house, prepared for the baby's arrival, and even took on some sewing work from Clara's cousin's shop, enjoying the chance to use her skills and earn a little extra money. In her 7th month, Faith received an unexpected letter from Mrs. Robinson in Jackson. Her father had fallen ill with pneumonia, the same disease that had taken her mother. He was not expected to recover. "Should we go?" Hank asked when she showed him the letter, his face concerned. "It's a long journey in your condition, but if you want to see him one last time." Faith considered it, torn between lingering love for her father despite his rejection and practical concerns about traveling so far along in her pregnancy. "I don't think he would want to see me," she finally said. "And I can't risk the baby's health." Hank nodded in understanding. "We'll write to Mrs. Robinson then. Ask her to tell him that you forgive him, that you hope he finds peace." Faith's eyes filled with tears at this evidence of Hank's compassion. "Thank you for understanding." A week later, another letter arrived, this one bearing the news that Vernon Lawson had passed away peacefully in his sleep. To Faith's surprise, he had asked for her forgiveness in his final hours, and had amended his will to leave her the family Bible and a small sum of money, not a fortune, but enough to suggest that some softening had occurred in his heart at the end. Faith mourned her father, but found comfort in Hank's steady presence, and in the knowledge that she had tried to make peace before it was too late. And soon, the anticipation of their child's arrival overshadowed the grief. On a cold, clear morning in late January, Faith went into labor. Hank sent for the midwife, then stayed by Faith's side, holding her hand through the long hours of pain, whispering encouragement, bathing her forehead with cool cloths. "You're the strongest woman I've ever known," he told her as the labor intensified. "You can do this, Faith. I believe in you." After 16 hours, their son was born, a healthy baby boy with a shock of dark hair and lungs that announced his arrival to the entire neighborhood. The midwife placed him in Faith's arms, and Hank leaned close, his face alight with wonder. "He's perfect," Hank whispered, one finger gently stroking the baby's tiny cheek. "Absolutely perfect." Faith looked up at him, her face radiant despite her exhaustion. Would you like to hold your son?" Hank's eyes filled with tears as he carefully took the tiny bundle, cradling the baby as if he were made of the most delicate crystal. "Hello, little one," he murmured. "I'm your pa." Faith felt her heart might burst with love as she watched them together, this man who had chosen to love them both, and this innocent child who would grow up knowing only Hank's love, never the abandonment of his biological father. "What shall we name him?" Hank asked, still gazing in awe at the baby. Faith smiled. "I was thinking Matthew, after your father, Matthew Henry Calloway." Hank looked up, his eyes shining. "You'd name him after my father?" "Of course," Faith said softly. "He'll be raised as your son in every way that matters. He should bear the name of the family that will love him." Hank leaned down and kissed her, a kiss full of tenderness and love. "Matthew it is, then. Welcome to the world, Matthew Henry Calloway." Spring came early that year, bringing warm breezes and wildflowers to the plains around Cheyenne. Faith often sat on the front porch with Matthew, watching as Hank worked in the small vegetable garden he had started at the side of the house. "Your pa is a good man," she would tell the baby, who would stare up at her with wide, curious eyes. "The very best of men." Life settled into a rhythm of quiet joy. Hank continued his work as a deputy marshal, but arranged his duties to allow more time at home with his family. Faith cared for Matthew and took on more sewing work, finding fulfillment in both motherhood and her small but growing business. Clara visited from Jackson when Matthew was 3 months old, staying for 2 weeks and thoroughly spoiling her honorary grandson with handmade toys and endless cuddles. She and Faith spent long hours catching up, and Clara was delighted to see how happy Faith had become in her new life. "You're glowing," she told Faith. "Motherhood and marriage suit you." "I never imagined I could be this happy," Faith confessed. "After everything that happened with Thomas, I thought I'd ruined my life. But Hank—" She looked across the room to where her husband was showing Matthew a colorful picture book. "Hank saved me in more ways than one." One evening, after Clara had returned to Jackson and Matthew was sleeping peacefully in his cradle, Hank and Faith sat together on the porch swing, enjoying the lingering twilight. Faith's head rested on Hank's shoulder, his arm around her waist, their hands intertwined. "You ever regret it?" Faith asked softly. "Taking on a woman with so much baggage, raising another man's child as your own." Hank turned to face her, his expression serious. "Faith Calloway, the day I stepped between you and your father was the luckiest day of my life. I've never regretted it, not for a single moment." He brushed a strand of hair from her face. "And Matthew isn't another man's child. He's ours, my son in every way that matters." Faith felt tears prick her eyes. "I love you so much, Hank. Sometimes I still can't believe this is real, that you're real." "I'm real," Hank assured her, pulling her closer. "And I'll be here, loving you and Matthew for the rest of our lives." As the stars came out above them, Faith sent up a silent prayer of gratitude for the man beside her, the cowboy who had stepped between her and harm, who had claimed her as his to protect, and who had given her the greatest gift of all, a love that was steady and true, a home where she and her son were cherished, a future filled with promise. And as Hank's lips found hers in the gathering darkness, Faith knew with absolute certainty that their story, born in a moment of crisis on a dusty street in Jackson, would continue to unfold in joy and love for all the years to come. 5 years later, the Calloway home in Cheyenne was filled with the sound of children's laughter. Matthew, now a sturdy 5-year-old with his mother's honey-colored hair and his father's hazel eyes, chased his 2-year-old sister Emma through the house, their giggles echoing from room to room. Faith, her hands dusted with flour from the bread she was baking, paused to watch them with a smile. Emma had been a surprise, a joyous one. Faith had discovered she was expecting just after Matthew's 3rd birthday, and Hank had been over the moon at the news. The sound of the front door opening drew Faith's attention. Hank entered, removing his hat and hanging it on the peg by the door. Though there was now a touch of gray at his temples, he was still as handsome as the day he had first stepped into her life. "Pa!" Matthew cried, abandoning his game with Emma to launch himself at Hank. Hank caught him, swinging him up into his arms with practiced ease. "How's my boy today? Keeping an eye on your sister like I asked?" "Yes, sir," Matthew said seriously. "She tried to eat a bug, but I stopped her." Hank laughed, setting Matthew down to scoop up Emma, who was toddling toward him with outstretched arms. "That's my good man," he said, ruffling Matthew's hair before kissing Emma's chubby cheek. Faith wiped her hands on her apron and moved to greet her husband. Hank's arm slipped around her waist, pulling her close for a kiss that, even after 5 years, still made her heart race. "How are you feeling today?" he asked, his free hand coming to rest gently on the slight swell of her belly. "Better," Faith assured him. Their 3rd child, due in the winter, had given her a difficult first few months, but the worst of the morning sickness seemed to be passing. "Dr. Wilson says everything is progressing normally." Hank's expression was tender as he looked at her. "I'm glad to hear it. I worry about you, you know." Faith leaned into his embrace, savoring the solidity of him. "I know, but I'm strong, remember? You've always said so." "The strongest woman I know," Hank agreed, pressing a kiss to her temple. Later that night, after the children were asleep, Faith and Hank sat together on the porch swing that had become their special place. The stars were bright overhead, the air mild with summer warmth. "I had a letter from Clara today," Faith said, her head resting on Hank's shoulder. "She's thinking of selling the store and moving to Cheyenne. Says she's getting too old to run the place alone, and she misses us, especially the children." "That would be wonderful," Hank said. "We have the room if she wanted to stay with us until she finds a place of her own." Faith smiled, unsurprised by his generous offer. It was so typical of the man she had married, always thinking of others, always ready to help. "I'll write to her tomorrow, extend the invitation." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the gentle creaking of the swing the only sound. Faith thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment, from that terrible day in Jackson, when Hank had first stepped between her and harm, to this peaceful night, surrounded by the family they had built together. "Penny for your thoughts," Hank said, his fingers playing with a strand of her hair. Faith smiled up at him. "I was just thinking about how fortunate I am, how one moment of courage yours changed everything for me, for us." Hank's arm tightened around her. "I'm the fortunate one, Faith. When I saw you that day, I knew I had to help you. I never imagined I was finding my heart, my home, my future." Faith reached up to touch his face, tracing the familiar lines with tender fingers. "Do you remember what you said, when you stepped between me and my father? "That you were mine to protect," Hank said softly. "And you still are, Faith. You and our children. Always." As the stars wheeled overhead and the night deepened around them, Faith nestled closer to her husband, secure in the knowledge that she was loved, protected, cherished. What had begun in a moment of crisis had blossomed into a lifetime of joy. And as Hank's lips found hers in a kiss that still held all the passion and promise of their first embrace, Faith knew that their story was still being written, day by day, heart by heart, in the steady rhythm of love that would sustain them for all the years to come.